Hi everybody, my name is Angelica and I'm happy to be welcoming you to the Introduction to History in the School of Roses. This class will be run like an asynchronous online class. If any of you guys have done that type of class before, I'll be posting a video at the beginning of the week. I do expect you guys to watch the video and engage in discussions. I'll be posting the discussion times around the same time that I post this video. There is going to be some reading for this class. It's not going to be too much, but it will very much benefit your understanding of the topics that we discussed to complete those readings. And so on that note, I do think it's time for me to get started. So, like any history class, the first couple things we're going to discuss for this week are the identifications, or the IDs. You don't really need to know exact definitions, but these are words that are going to be important to understanding history as it's taught by me. So some of the words that we want to make sure that we understand by the end of today's lecture are prehistory, history, primary source, secondary source, civilization, religion, specialization, anachronism, and then the other column you have Tigris, Euphrates, Mesopotamia, Yellow River, Australopithecines. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. I'll probably pronounce it 5 other ways as we go through this lecture today. And under Australopithecines, you're going to talk about Lucy, which is a very specific one. We also are going to learn about Homo sapiens sapiens and Neanderthals. So it's important to note that in this class we will not be using BC or AD. Rather, we'll be using the classification favored by historians, which is BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era. This is because BC and AD are primarily Western Christian concepts, and it is more secular and a more well-rounded way to refer to time periods as BCE and CE. And if you ever take any history classes in the future, that is how your professors are going to be referring to them. So what is history? Some of the questions you guys might want to discuss this week is, how do you define history? I can tell you how I define history, and it is the study of past human events. What is prehistory? Generally, prehistory is defined as human events before the invention of writing. And why the distinction? The invention of writing and record keeping allows us to learn more specifics than other types of sources. So before history, in the prehistory, all we really have to go on is artifacts and paintings and pieces of clothes and shards of pottery and dwellings. And so from those things you can gather a lot of information. You can figure out what these people ate, how they hunted, where they lived, what they wore, but you can't really get a lot about what they thought or what their belief system was, about what their social structure was. But when you have that writing, when you have that documentation, you can glean a much greater understanding of the thoughts and feelings of the people that lived. And that's why history is kind of after the invention of writing and documentation. So now we're going to get into primary versus secondary sources. If you've ever taken a history class in high school or college, I'm not sure what they call those schools in other countries, you probably have had this topic, but it's very important to know the differences between these two things. Primary sources are any source of information that was created in the time period in question, for example, diaries. And secondary sources is any source that discusses the time period in question after the fact, like textbooks. Something that I want you guys to do this week is I would like you guys to go into class discussion, and among some of the other discussion questions, I would like you guys to each send me an example of a primary source and a secondary source. And do make sure that you label which one is which so that your classmates can refer to that as well as this PowerPoint. So what? I've talked about primary sources. Why? What does that mean? It's important to it's important to be able to distinguish primary and secondary sources because the authors of secondary sources will always offer their own interpretations of a primary source. Primary sources will have their own biases, but you may draw a different conclusion than another scholar. So, primary sources are going to have the biases of whoever wrote them. If you're looking at something from, say, the American Civil War, and you're looking at a document from the North, the Union, or from the South, the Confederacy, each of those people are going to have their own biases. However, those are going to be actual documents from the time that are describing how people are experiencing it. Now, if you have somebody, if you're reading somebody's interpretation of those letters, and they're giving context and talking about those letters, that's a secondary source. And that person is adding their own biases. That person is adding their own interpretations. And so you're not getting that raw knowledge that you would be receiving from a primary source. Another example is the novel The Song of Achilles. This novel gets tossed around a lot in our server. But The Song of Achilles is not a primary source. I believe that this book was written in 2011, and it is a great adaptation of a Greek myth, but it is not actually part of Greek mythology. If you read The Song of Achilles, you will find that the characterization and the behavior and the actions of a lot of characters never really show up in the original myth. And so it's very clear that this author has added their own biases to it. So now we're going to now that we've kind of set the stage for what these different sources are, we're going to get into kind of evolution and how we got to humanity and civilization. The predecessors to humanity, in order to get to us humans, are Homo sapiens sapiens. That's what humanity is. Primates left the trees. They became bipedal. They began to use tools. They got control of fire, and control of fire is something that you will find across mythologies. Almost every religion, mythology, anything like that is going to have some sort of story, origin story, about how people got control of fire, because fire is incredibly important. Before I talk about this, fire allows us to cook food, and when you cook food, you can gain access to more nutrients than you would get from non-cooked food, and those nutrients allowed Homo sapiens sapiens to grow the brains that we have. The reason why we have such highly developed brains is because we are able to get more nutrient from our diet, and maintain that. That's also why it's important to make sure that you have a healthy diet, because you need to make sure you're nurturing that brain. So the Australopithecines are a predecessor to humanity. They were initially discovered in North Africa by, the Lovegoods. I believe it was the Lovegoods. The first ever one was named Lucy, after the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles. And they are, I believe, one of our closest relatives prior to Homo sapiens sapiens. They kind of tie humanity back to other primates. So eventually primates left Africa. A bunch of close relatives to humanity left Africa, where they evolved. This includes Homo sapiens sapiens, this includes Neanderthals, Homo erectus. These types of these types of primates migrated out of Africa, and there was actually crossbreeding between Homo sapiens sapiens and Neanderthals. It's very interesting. There's my next point. Neanderthals were a different type of primate, closely related, but not the same as Homo sapiens sapiens, but they were able to copulate and produce viable offspring. Oh my goodness. Okay guys, sorry for the interruption. Thank you for your understanding. And so you'll find that a lot of people actually have Neanderthal DNA in their genes. It's very interesting. As they left Africa, they were pretty nomadic, but you begin to see the domestication of plants and animals. And this point is crucial. When humanity figures out how to domesticate plants and animals, that's when you see a big shift in culture. This is when you go from the nomadic to a sedentary lifestyle. Nomadic meaning you roam around, you kind of find food here and there. This is like the hunter-gatherer type of lifestyles. Sedentary lifestyles is where you set up a house, you have a farm, you have agriculture, pigs, sheep, cows, and when you have this type of lifestyle, when you have this sedentary lifestyle, this is where you get the seeds of civilization. When you have agriculture, from the domestication of plants and animals, you start to be able to accumulate resources. And the accumulation of resources allows people to not be worried about food all of the time. And when you're not worried about food all of the time, you're able to go and explore other aspects of what you kind of want out of life. So when you're not worried about food, maybe you're going to go and you're going to learn carpentry. You're going to go and you're going to learn painting. You're going to go and you're going to devote yourself to the church. You are able to do something called specialization, where it becomes there's a certain group of people who does farming for everybody else. And because everybody is able to, sorry, let me rephrase that, because this group of people is covering food, anybody who's not covering food is able to go and explore other opportunities, and they become specialized in those other opportunities. So the development of civilization, we saw the seeds of civilization. Now, where did civilization develop? And I apologize for the maps. I will send better maps into the chat. Everybody who has gone through a world history class has probably heard of the Tigris and Euphrates River. That is in the Middle East. You can see on the map that it's in modern-day Iraq and Turkey. A lot of times this is credited as the birthplace of civilization. This was referred to as Mesopotamia. Other civilizations in this area was Sumer. I'm not going to get too much into these because this is going to be more about next week's class. Civilization developed over here around 5000 BCE. And when I say civilization, I'm talking about organized systems of living. This is where you see your city-states, the beginnings of city-states. Another place where civilization developed, which is often not taught about in Western schools, is the Yellow River. And this is where Chinese civilization developed and where their oldest dynasties are credited to. And the birth of civilization in this river valley happened around 4000 BCE. So it wasn't too long after Mesopotamia. There was a little bit of a distance, but given the land distance, these two things, you can pretty safely say that they developed around the same time, and they weren't completely independent, but they were largely independent of each other, and that's why you see such differences in the culture based on kind of where the civilization popped up. So, just to review, domestication of plants and animals leads to agriculture. Agriculture leads to an abundance of resources. An abundance of resources leads to specialization. And here's where we get to some new things. Specialization leads to stratification. That means that when people begin to specialize in certain things, then people begin to create hierarchies for those things. You know, whoever has the biggest house or can grow the most crops, he's at the top. If you grow the least crops, you're at the bottom. Because this person who has the most crops is at the top, now he's the leader because he has the most access to resources. He now, because he has the most crops, probably will have other people working his land for him, so he's able to go and do other things like be a leader or paint or fight armies or fight in the army. And so now you see this development of a stratification, and this hierarchy in people allows for certain people to become leaders and certain people to become followers, and all of these things together of people doing different jobs with different roles with different amounts of power leads to civilization. Civilization meaning that there is like a town or a city-state, what you would think of as like a modern-day civilization. And then when you're able to have this kind of steady income and this stratified society and it becomes balanced, then you can kind of get into what we think of as organized religion, because now people are able to devote their time to being priests instead of devoting their time to just surviving. So something I want to cover, this is another word that I want everybody to be able to know, is the word anachronism. What does it mean to say something is anachronistic? So let's break this word down to the roots. Ana means backwards, chronos means time. And so the dictionary definition is an anachronism is a chronological inconsistency in some arrangement, especially a juxtaposition of persons, events, objects, language, terms, and customs from different time periods. That's wordy and uses a lot of academic language. How I describe an anachronism is applying thoughts, feelings, ideals, morals, knowledge, etc. onto time periods that they do not apply to. So that would be like taking our modern ideas of sexuality, like gay, straight, and lesbian, and trying to apply it to the ancient Greeks. or even trying to apply it to civilizations and people from 500 years ago. These people are going to have completely different thoughts, feelings, ideals, and morals than we do. So, for instance, to say that, something that a lot of modern day queer theorists talk about, and this, I'm often going to talk about queer theory and people and the LGBTQ community because I'm queer myself, and so I have a lot of knowledge in that. So when you look back at even like the cowboys in like the 1800s, there were a lot of women who would dress up as men or dress in male clothing, and they would go and they would live their lives as men, and they would marry women, and they would fully live their lives as men. And a lot of people will try and put these women who dressed in male clothing, which is the best way we can describe them, try to put them into the category of this person's a butch lesbian, this person's a trans man. Our modern day vocabulary does not apply to these historical people. Maybe if they had this vocabulary, they would pick the one that they thought applied to them best, but we can't put this historical person into a modern day category because they didn't have the same concepts of gender and sexuality that we do in the modern day. And so this is not to say that we cannot look back and say what this person did was fucked up. We can all look back and say, slavery was a fucked up thing that happened. This is really all just to say that we have to be very careful when looking and talking about history and mythology as we look into the past. We have to be very careful to acknowledge where we're coming from and our modern biases when we are looking at the past. That is the end of my presentation. I thank everybody who actually listened to this. If you listen to this in its entirety, DM me your favorite dog. And if I don't get a DM from you, I'll know you didn't watch it all the way through. So have a great day. Bye.